today's roundtable, Know Your Custodian, Key Considerations for Crypto Custody. This is the third of 5 roundtables in the Commission's spring sprint toward crypto clarity. For too long, investors and the firms that serve them have been subjected to significant uncertainty with respect to how regulated entities can custody customer assets in a manner compliant with our rules. This uncertainty has not advanced investor protection. Investors wanted access to crypto assets, whether through a commission-regulated entity or otherwise, but the Commission effectively deprived them of the choice to have their assets held by a registered entity or a qualified custodian. Today, we're fortunate to have 2 separate panels, one dealing with broker-dealer custody and the other with custody under the 40 Acts. Both panels feature experts with years of experience studying these issues, and they'll help us think through how best the Commission can provide clarity and certainty in this space. Thank you all for agreeing to participate in this discussion. We're also fortunate to have our new chairman join us for what I believe is his first appearance as chairman at a public event of the Commission. At his swearing in this week, Chairman Atkins made clear to the President his intention to bring a rational, coherent, and principled approach to digital asset regulation at the SEC. The task force looks forward to helping the Commission execute Chairman Atkins and Commissioner Peirce's vision for a rational and right-sized regulatory framework for crypto assets. The task force would also like to express its appreciation to Commissioner Ueda for creating the task force as one of his first official acts as acting chairman, and for his support during his acting chairmanship. I've worked for Commissioner Peirce for over 7 years, and for many of them, she was alone in calling for the Commission to take a sensible approach to these issues. It's been refreshing to have Commissioner Ueda so aligned on the subject. Before I turn the podium over to Chairman Atkins and our commissioners, I would like to remind everyone that this event is being streamed live and is being covered by multiple media outlets. Accordingly, please be aware that all remarks by Commission officials, participants, and members of our audience will be on the record. In addition, please remember that the participants in today's roundtable speak on their own behalf and that their views do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission, the Commissioners, or members of the Commission staff. We're now ready to begin with remarks from Chairman Atkins, followed by Commissioner Crenshaw, Commissioner Ueda, and Commissioner Peirce. Mr. Chairman.
So thank you all very much for coming today and listening online out in the internet land. And so welcome to the third roundtable of the SEC's Crypto Task Force. And as Richard was saying, I really do salute the Commission in taking this initiative on, and Commissioner Ueda for acting on it, and obviously for Commissioner Peirce and all the staff's work. But so this is now my 4th day back at the Commission after 2 prior stints here, and I really am looking forward to working here and eager to tackle long festering issues such as the regulatory treatment of digital assets and distributed ledger technologies, and working with my fellow commissioners and the staff in doing it, and soliciting outside input as well, obviously. So in addition, my warmest personal thanks go to Commissioner Peirce for her principled and tireless advocacy for common sense crypto policy within the United States. It's no wonder that she justly has earned the title of Crypto Mom, and Commissioner Peirce is certainly the right person to lead the effort to come up with a rational regulatory framework for crypto assets in their markets. And thanks also to the panelists, both in this panel and the one to come, for volunteering their time and expertise on a Friday afternoon to come here and join us in Washington. So this is important work as entrepreneurs across the United States are harnessing blockchain technology to modernize aspects of the financial system. I expect huge benefits from this market innovation in terms of efficiency, cost reduction, transparency, and risk mitigation. Market participants engaging with this technology deserve clear regulatory rules of the road. Innovation, unfortunately, has been stifled for the last several years due to market and regulatory uncertainty that, unfortunately, the SEC has fostered. So I look forward to engaging with market participants and working with colleagues in President Trump's administration and Congress to establish a rational, fit-for-purpose framework for crypto assets. So today's roundtable is focused on the challenges that SEC registrants face when attempting to safely custody crypto assets for their customers in compliance with the federal securities laws. For example, are changes needed to the custody rules under the Exchange Act, the Advisors Act, or the Investment Company Act to accommodate crypto assets and blockchain technology? Is the special purpose broker-dealer, so-called regime, workable for market participants, or is a new crypto asset broker-dealer framework needed? The market itself seems to indicate that the current framework badly needs attention, so you all, especially on the panels, can help give us direction in that regard. So thank you all for dedicating your Friday afternoon to helping us address these very important issues. So I look forward to a productive discussion and so you all can get to it. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our new chairman, Paul Atkins, to the commission. I'm looking forward to working with him and my fellow commissioners in furtherance of the agency's important mission. So custody. The concept of custody in the federal securities laws is based on the idea of trust. In our everyday lives, relationships involving trust are everywhere. For example, when we fly, we generally trust that we can give an airline our luggage and they won't steal it. And generally it will be delivered to its destination safely. Of course, luggage gets lost sometimes and that's inconvenient and frustrating. Maybe you lose some clothes or your vacation gets off to a slightly more stressful start. But just for a moment, imagine that a significant portion of your life savings is actually in that luggage. Would you ask the airline a few more questions before checking your bag into their care? Would you want assurances that they are required to take certain protective measures to safeguard your luggage? That they have robust policies and procedures designed to prevent loss and damage? And that they bear accountability in the event that they do not follow through on those policies and procedures and your savings are lost. Trust is particularly important in our relationships with financial institutions. That's why our custody regulations are so important. We have seen that harm befalls investors when their money is in the hands of untrustworthy actors. The worst of those cases are infamous. But beyond trust, history has taught us that even the most responsible actors need regulatory standards to effectively safeguard customer assets. So the questions that bring us here today are, whom can we trust to safeguard client assets? What basic standards should we apply to ensure that we can trust our custodians? Should the rules be any different for crypto assets? Are there features of crypto assets distinct from more traditional assets that warrant distinct rules? Some believe that differences between traditional assets justify exemptions or disparate treatment for custody of crypto assets under our rules. If we are to consider implementing an alternative custody regime for crypto assets, something the SEC has not done wholesale for another asset class without very good reason, we must keep in mind some guiding principles. Existing SEC custody rules are a gold standard of investor protection. Our registrants attract customers. Our markets draw stability from the strength of this regulatory framework. If the SEC were to create a dual regime, how do we ensure that the crypto regime is as robust as the current regime? Additionally, how could the Commission address increased risks to investors and the broader financial system that may stem from the different crypto custody rules. For example, how would the rules address risks associated with holding assets on a blockchain, such as those stemming from protocol or smart contract operations or failures? And what about hacking? Also, the nature of the blockchain means that custodians cannot establish exclusive control over digital assets with the same mechanisms used in connection with traditional securities. Can we effectively hold custodians accountable for mitigating such risks? If so, how? How would we ensure that investors have clarity regarding the differences between the risks associated with traditional custodians and the risks associated with crypto asset custodians? What steps would we need to take to help investors understand that these entities do not offer the same protections? What investor disclosures would be required under the applicable fiduciary obligations? What protections would exist for investors if their custodian becomes insolvent or declares bankruptcy? Existing securities law provides protections against this risk. For example, by providing for SIPC to step in when a brokerage firm fails and customer assets are missing, so that SIPC may work to return customer assets. Will such protections be available for crypto assets if there are different standards for custody? I understand today's roundtable will be separated into two segments, one focused on investment advisor and investment company custody issues, and the other on custody in a broker-dealer context. There are important distinctions between these two frameworks that should be considered today. For the asset management industry, the custody rule gives us a clear answer on who advisors must trust with custody of advisory client assets: a qualified custodian. The rule does not intend for just anyone to meet this standard or this definition. It is meant to be a high bar accompanied by robust protections. In its recent safeguarding proposal, the SEC acknowledged the ways in which custody of crypto assets and the use of blockchain technology present unique risks and unique considerations. I expect today's discussion will raise ideas like advisor self-custody for crypto assets and potential expansions to the type of entities that could meet the definition of a qualified custodian. I hope you will think through the ramifications for those possibilities. For example, what are the risks of self-custody generally? Would these risks be heightened with self-custody of crypto assets? Would a hypothetical exemption from the custody rule for crypto assets invite easier opportunities for fraud, theft, or misappropriation, even with additional protections? Are most investment advisors operationally capable of safely engaging in self-custody of crypto assets? What are the barriers to crypto asset custodians seeking the licenses or registrations that would allow them to be considered qualified custodians under the custody rule? How should we think about state-chartered trust companies? How do those entities vary across states? Do they all offer comparable protections? In what ways must we engage with our fellow financial regulators on these and related questions? Should we require different or additional policies and procedures of advisors who custody crypto assets at crypto asset custodians? What should these important requirements, such as independent verification of assets, look like in the context of crypto assets? Does an advisor's fiduciary duty require additional due diligence for these assets? While registered broker-dealers operate under a different set of custody rules, some of the most prominent crypto market players are large platforms not registered with the SEC, which function as integrated brokerages and exchanges. They require customers to transfer their crypto assets into a wallet held by the exchange in order to trade on the platform or utilize other platform services such as lending or staking. One pressing custody question is this: if the platforms will be transacting in securities and be regulated by the SEC in some way, how should the SEC address the predominant practice of holding customers' crypto assets in omnibus wallets? This question has been considered by several thought leaders in the space, some of whom we're lucky enough to have on the panels with us today. They have pointed out that with omnibus wallets, customer transactions are largely tracked using books and records rather than through on-chain transactions. In that context, where a majority of customer transactions are happening off-chain, what, if any, jurisdiction is there for different custody rules? Omnibus wallets also pose increased risks as compared to segregated wallets, such as exposing the assets to greater operational and external risks like hacking or theft. Given that, should exchanges or broker-dealers be allowed to custody crypto asset securities in omnibus wallets at all? What are the other risks and benefits of custodying customer crypto assets in omnibus versus segregated wallets? As you can tell, I am concerned about the potential for eroding the high standard required under our existing custody rules. While we have been and should continue to be open to innovative and new products and technologies, such advancements do not require us to forsake fundamental statutorily mandated principles, like safeguarding client assets. How can we bridge that gap so that investors are afforded consistent protections regardless of asset class? As with all the roundtables to date, these are hard questions, and I had a lot today, so I appreciate your patience. I hope you will help us grapple with these issues so that we can preserve the trust that investors have in our markets. There is a lot more than lost luggage at stake. Thank you all for your participation in today's roundtable, and I look forward to hearing the outcome. Thanks very much.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the Crypto Task Force's third roundtable, which is focused on custody. Proper custody of client and customer assets have been a key protection under the federal securities laws. Crypto is not any different in principle. As commission registrants increasingly engage with crypto assets, it's important that they have access to a number of custodial solutions that comply with applicable laws and regulations. While the Office of the Chief Accountant recently removed a significant barrier for companies seeking to offer crypto asset custodial services by withdrawing Staff Accounting Bulletin number 121 earlier this year, there is still work to do to ensure that there is appropriate choice among custodial solutions. For example, the Commission should consider whether it is clear enough that registered investment advisors can use state-chartered limited-purpose trust companies to custody crypto assets as fiduciaries, as qualified custodians in compliance with our rules under the Advisors Act. Limited-purpose trust companies, with the authorization and oversight of a state banking regulator, such as the New York State Department of Financial Services or the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, which I had the privilege of, at one point, being part of many years ago, might be able to custody crypto assets as fiduciaries, arguably exercising fiduciary powers similar to those permitted to national banks under the authority of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. With respect to federally chartered banks, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency issued interpretive letters recognizing that national banks may custody crypto assets as a fiduciary under the National Bank Act and authorized multiple national banks to do so. Given the historical approach of permitting state-chartered banks to compete with federally chartered banks, the Commission should consider allowing advisors to use state-chartered limited-purpose trust companies with the fiduciary power to custody crypto assets as qualified custodians. The Commission should also consider further steps to enhance competition by modifying or sunsetting the Commission's special-purpose broker regime, providing interim guidance that explains how firms can custody non-security crypto asset securities, and traditional securities in compliance with the capital and customer protection rules, and ultimately perhaps even codifying this guidance in amendments to these rules. Separately, the position of the prior administration that most crypto assets are likely to be funds or securities has led many advisors to shoehorn all client crypto assets into qualified custody and thereby forego certain investment opportunities that are incompatible with these custodial arrangements. I agree with Commissioner Peirce that a large number of crypto assets are not likely to be securities, but the term funds is not defined in the custody rule, and the Commission may need to clarify whether any crypto assets constitute funds for purposes of the rule. Well, these are also a lot of issues to raise, and that is why I am so pleased that we have these two very, very well put together panels for this afternoon. There are a lot of questions and issues and thoughts for us to resolve. And one of the most important things that we do as a commission is to engage and listen to the public and obtain this feedback. So before we move on to doing what we need to do, I look forward to hearing all of the comments today, as well as the comments that the public is submitting through our written feedback file. So thank you to the Crypto Task Force and panelists for your time in preparing this roundtable, and I look forward to the discussions that will follow.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to our panelists on this panel and the later panel. Grateful for the time that you're spending today and the time that you put into preparing for the panels. I also want to thank the task force and all the other folks at the SEC who made this roundtable possible. I too want to thank Commissioner Ueda for your work as acting chairman, and welcome Chairman Atkins. And also want to thank Commissioner Crenshaw, who's been helpful, among other things, in helping us put together the panels, finding panelists who can help answer some of these difficult questions. It is going to be, I think, a very interesting discussion. But let me add my own thoughts just quickly before I turn it over to Zach. Thank you for moderating today's discussions. So children often play a game called The Floor is Lava. The game requires you to leap from one piece of furniture to the next without falling or touching the ground, because if you do, you perish in the burning lava below. So, of course, we have our own version of that game in D.C., and that has been really evident. It's been played a lot in the crypto asset world, and crypto custody, I think, is one area where it's really been played. We have a little twist on it. The burning lava is, of course, legal treachery, but our twist on it is that we don't turn the lights on. So to engage in crypto-related activities, SEC registrants have had to hop from one poorly illuminated regulatory space to the next, all while ensuring that they never touch any crypto asset. A broker or ATS that cannot custody or otherwise handle an asset will find it difficult to facilitate trading in the asset, and a robust market is therefore unlikely to develop. If investment advisors don't know which crypto assets are securities, what type of entities are qualified custodians, and whether exercising staking or voting rights will result in custody violations, advisors may not be able to serve their clients' best interests. Similar confusion may prevent investment companies from investing in crypto assets and investing in a way that would be most efficient or beneficial to the fund. It's time that we find a way to end this game. We need to turn on the lights and build some walkways over the lava pit. We, of course, should not take custodial obligations lightly. When an intermediary holds a crypto asset, or any asset for that matter, investors and the intermediary itself can face serious risks. The Commission must grapple with these issues. If we fail to do so, we prevent regulated entities from serving their customers and elevate, to the detriment of the American public, markets and intermediaries that may be less safe than our regulated entities. We must ensure that the custody requirements applicable to regulated entities further rather than impair investor protection and choice. And these requirements must not interfere with an advisor's discretion about how to fulfill its fiduciary obligations. Our regulatory approach should recognize the differences across crypto assets. Qualified custodians exist for some crypto assets, but for others, self-custody might be the safer option. Many tokenized securities involve the use of smart contracts or other blockchain-related protocols that allow the issuer or its agent to take corrective measures in the event of an error or lost or stolen private keys, just as it could resolve issues when using a traditional database. Indeed, distributed ledgers could mitigate some risks associated with traditional databases. For example, a broker-dealer's ability to control an uncertificate security on-chain arguably makes it easier for the broker-dealer to demonstrate that it's the legal owner of a security if the issuer or its agent were to mismanage any off-chain ownership records. Finally, we should acknowledge and welcome the fact that blockchain technology empowers investors by allowing them to self-custody, trade, and otherwise engage with their assets without the use of any intermediary. Our regulatory framework should not stand in the way of these innovations by forcing intermediation. I look forward to hearing the panelists' thoughts on these and other issues. While this roundtable is focused on custody, and I think there are some tangential issues that I would also appreciate hearing views on if there's time. Should the SEC amend or clarify other rules that may be just as important in protecting customer assets, such as capital, record keeping, and financial reporting rules? Before turning it over to Zach, let me add to Commissioner Crenshaw's already long list of questions another set of questions. So if you run out of things to talk about, you can answer some of these questions. Should Congress amend SIPA to address the treatment of crypto assets that are not securities as defined in SIPA? In the absence of any such amendments, how can we help ensure that customers receive their crypto assets and any cash deposited to purchase those assets in the event of a broker-dealer liquidation? Does Article 8 of the UCC present a potential solution to this issue? Should we retain the special purpose broker-dealer framework, or should we clarify how any broker-dealer may custody or crypto assets that are securities? What requirements should apply to broker-dealers when custodying tokenized securities that are not bearer instruments? Should SEC staff modify or replace the so-called ATS three-step letter? If so, how? Should we provide any guidance or propose amendments to address how our rules apply to broker-dealers that use smart contracts to facilitate settlement? Given that Rule 15c3.3 does not apply to crypto assets that are not securities, what can we do to ensure that broker-dealers appropriately safeguard any such assets held for customers? Should the custody rules permit funds and advisors to place and maintain crypto assets with classes of custodians not currently contemplated by those rules? Alternatively, should the custody rules be principles-based and incorporate qualitative criteria as opposed to being focused solely on certain entities that may custody assets? And finally, should we propose changes to the advisor and investment company custody rules to facilitate self-custody of crypto assets? And if so, under what conditions? That's all I have. Thank you, and go to it, panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Chairman Atkins, Commissioners Uyeda, Pearson, Crenshaw, and to the staff for organizing this event. Very happy to be here, and thank the panelists for coming and sharing your expertise on these issues. I've heard suggestions from some crypto legal friends of mine that these panels would be great drinking games because there's lots of buzzwords, and you can spend a lot of time listening to those buzzwords. And to them, I'd say that they should be like the custodians that we're going to talk about today and make sure to do so responsibly. Coming out of a period that many have viewed as regulation by enforcement, over the past few months, there's been a burst of energy among a lot of market participants for all things that can be done with blockchain technology, ways to harness the technology for advancement, but importantly, while ensuring that investors are protected under an appropriate regulatory regime. And lots of these discussions come back to the same question, which is, okay, those things are all great, working through the legal analysis, now what do we do about custody? If an asset is a security, likely a broker-dealer needs to be involved, and that broker-dealer can't custody the asset unless it can do so in compliance with 15c3.3. But there, in most cases, is no regulatory approved way for them to do that. When tokens are traded, whether or not they're securities, whether it's on a centralized exchange or DeFi, can broker-dealers or investment advisors actually handle the asset without there being clarity on this question? And if we tokenize securities, so there's no question that the asset is a security, then what? How do we deal with the custody rule? These are issues that have come up on a lot of the prior roundtables, but I think this one gets to this issue in particular that I think is really necessary to solve all the others. It's an incredibly thorny issue. By their nature, digital assets, blockchain tokens, are not the sort of asset that the securities laws and rules have contemplated, at least not as currently written. My impression, and others likely agree, or I imagine agree, are that for a long time, because this is a hard question, there wasn't really the regulatory appetite to tackle it, to dig in and figure out how to solve it. There have been some efforts at guidance in the past, joint staff statement, the special purpose broker-dealer guidance, the three-step no action letter, and the safeguarding proposal. But in many ways, these sort of highlighted the challenges without really taking the step of solving it. So it's incredibly impressive, and not a word associated with regulators that much, I think pretty courageous, that the SEC is now undertaking to do these hard things. And also doing so in a transparent and open manner with a sort of regulatory humility that recognizes the importance of robust public input, particularly from industry members that are really in the trenches and have the experience and knowledge of how to solve these issues. It may be difficult, but the importance and centrality of custody is really important and critical to get right for innovators, investors, and regulators. So the Commission has gathered a great set of panelists today whose backgrounds fit that bill. As in past roundtables, their bios are available on the website. I think if you're watching online, it's probably linked on the screen. We're going to skip introductions. Anyone who speaks, if you could, the first time you speak, just say your name and your affiliation. And if one regulatory regime for custody wasn't enough, today we're going to talk about three. This first panel is going to focus on broker-dealers and the regulatory regime for them. And panel this afternoon or later this afternoon is going to talk about investment advisors and investment companies. So make sure to stay tuned for that one. A lot of the issues do cross over. So beginning with our first panel, I'll take a moment to set the stage for broker-dealer regulation of custody. The Exchange Act prohibits a broker-dealer from affecting a transaction in securities unless they are in compliance with the SEC rules around custody. The SEC rules in turn require that broker-dealers maintain possession or control of customers' fully paid and excess margin securities. Possession traditionally meant a broker holds a physical piece of paper, stock certificate, in their vault, while control means they hold custody through a third party, like a bank or another broker-dealer or a clearing agency. So to start off, is physical possession or control even the right standard for broker-dealers when it comes to digital assets? And a lot of what we'll talk about today, I may not distinguish between digital assets that are securities and not, because I think often the custody issues are the same. Is that the right standard? Or is there another concept that the SEC should be considering for digital assets than possession or control? And maybe I'll start with Mark.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, everybody. My name is Mark Greenberg from Kraken. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll try to stay out of the specific legal terms and take an operator perspective at it. The first thing that's worth keeping in mind is crypto assets are best held at rest, safest, less likely to cause issues like the Bybit hack or otherwise. And what does that mean for custody, and what does that mean for this rule? It really means how the more you segregate assets into small little wallets, the more you focus on them in that respect, the more often you have to move it. And the more often you have to move it, the more it isn't at rest, the more likely it is to get stolen in some various exploit along the way. Principle-based rule is probably better than a technology-based one in this case, and so technology is changing quickly, of course. Keys should be held in systems, not by people, and that means that the old rule of not my keys, not my crypto probably doesn't apply anymore in that respect. And smart contracts mean, actually, I may hold the keys, but I may not actually have effective control over the asset at the same time. And so I would encourage, and then multi-party control is also extremely important in this case as well, and preferable in providing the right safeguards and the right trust that your baggage isn't going to get lost along the way. All that together, the more we can rely on GL-based segregation versus wallet or key-based segregation, the better. And so I think probably maybe an effective control standard might be the right one in this case versus one around physical possession. And I hope as we set the rules here, they'll be less focused on the technology and the wallets and the keys and those components, and more focused on how do you make sure we have the right policies and controls on top of them.
And I guess taking on to the next step, what policies and controls do people think that should be? Rachel, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rachel Andarica. I'm from Anchorage Digital. We are a centralized custodian. So I want to just pick up on what Mark is saying. I think that for us, like the way that we've always thought about this and the reason why we got a federally chartered bank was to comply with the custody rule. So it's not only, I mean, custody within the digital asset space is inherently a security activity, right? So we think of this as the banking service that we offer, the security over those keys. And so when we talk about like what does that mean, like what does security mean, we think about the possession and exclusive control over that asset as being like part and parcel to how the security solution was built, right? And so that shouldn't be, I mean, there's lots of ways to, that has been done, lots of ways that custodial solutions have sprung up, but kind of you can meet those obligations of like proof of existence and exclusive control over the asset, right? Like, I mean, for us, we have keys generated in hardware through air gapping. So for us, the way that we think about our custodial solution, we built it around that concept of like the proof of existence and exclusive control and our ability to do that and to not really have to think about what's held in like quote cold storage and then what's transferred into like a hot wallet for movement.
Got it. So I guess you're talking about, are you talking about third-party custody where a broker holds it through a bank?
Yeah.
Or ways in which the broker can hold it itself? And do you think the broker should be able to hold it itself in accordance with those kinds of controls?
Yeah. So, I mean, we think that a bank is the best way to do this, right? That's why we did this. That's why we have subjected ourselves to these rules. That's something that we thought that was important for institutional custody and for institutional participation in this ecosystem. And so, I mean, a third party subject to a very high degree of regulatory scrutiny and standards, like not only from a physical security perspective, but also all of the controls that you have around that, right? Like your fiduciary segregation of assets, your information security, your compliance with laws, rules, and regulations, the capital that you have allocated, against the risks that you have identified. Like all of those things, together kind of make a standard that is comprehensive.
And Veronica, your firm provides self-hosted, self-custody wallets. Do you think that that's a better alternative or a solution? Should broker-dealers self-custody using their own wallets? How do you think that plays into this question about how they custody themselves through others or customers doing it on their own?
Sure, thank you. I'm Veronica McGregor. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Exodus. We are, in fact, a self-custody or unhosted wallet retail, like for consumers. And I think it's sort of paradoxical to consider, so just backing up a little bit to like the original ethos of crypto, right, was self-sovereignty, self-custody, no banks, no intermediaries, and here we are. But when we say self-custody in regards to broker-dealers, it's not really self-custody. I mean, they're custodying someone else's assets. So it's not self-custody as it's traditionally understood. In which case, I would suggest that anyone who's going to be in charge of someone else's assets have, very strict safeguards and framework around how they can do that safely, because one of the not your keys, not your coins, that's the mantra of crypto OGs at least. One of the points of that is that you are in charge of what happens to your assets. And so at Exodus, one of the things I say is we couldn't steal your money if we wanted to, because it's all in your individual wallet, so we can't do that. But if in the case where someone is actually holding someone else's assets, that's really not self-custody. So even though what it would be instead is, are broker-dealers going to be allowed to to custody their customers' assets? And so it's not really self-custody. But In that case, as I said, when you're holding someone else's assets, you need to be extra super secure about it.
Well, do you think that we shouldn't have custodians? Everyone should hold their own assets, and that's the safest way? You don't need to rely on somebody else and rely on their security. Just do it yourself.
I don't think that's practical or reasonable to make that assumption, despite the fact that we are a self-custody wallet and we definitely, espouse like the safety of holding your own assets. It's not practical to think about people from different generations or people who, would prefer something that they consider more convenient, and some people, would prefer the more traditional route of not having to, memorize 12-word seed phrase, or or that if they want to reset their password, they can do that. And some people are much more comfortable. That's just their comfort zone, is to have custody like in a bank situation. But I think the important thing to bear in mind here is optionality. What we really want to do is preserve the option for end users to be able to custody their own assets, and regardless of what kind of digital assets they are.
Got it. Jason, turning to you, in terms of the ways in which these can be secured, I know your firm provides primarily self-custody technology to your clients. What are the kinds of ways that broker-dealers, or banks for that matter, holding for broker-dealers, can make sure these are securely held? And does it need to be done that way, or are there other options? Let's get the SEC comfortable that this can be done in a way that is secure, and address some of Commissioner Crenshaw's concerns.
Yeah, I'm happy to be the person to do that. I'm Jason Algrante. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Fireblocks. So I really want to reframe this conversation, because I think there is an impulse to set self-custody solutions up against custodial solutions, bank custody solutions, and compare the two. And I think in actuality, they can both be either really good or really bad, right? And so, I think it's a way of thinking that was introduced all the way back in the 1930s, switching over to the investment advisor context now and looking at the qualified custody rule, right? Qualification in the qualified custody rule meant regulated entity status. If you were a bank, if you were a futures commission merchant, you were a broker-dealer, you were good. What I'm concerned about in the digital asset context is there's no reason to believe, based on pure regulated entity status today, that you are a good custodian repository for digital assets. That requires a further step. And what I think we should be focusing on is taking that further step. So what I mean by that is the introduction of qualitative standards, principle-based standards for SEC registrant firms that want to engage in digital asset custody, right? And this is something that I think ideally cuts across solutions, right? Such that you have a reasonable amount of trust as an investor that when you have your assets with the investment advisor, with the broker-dealer, whether they are self-custodying or holding it at a bank custodian, those service providers are both being assessed in the same way, and again, with a qualitative eye.
And how do they get assessed?
Yeah, so I think there's a great opportunity for the SEC and really the regulatory community to serve a sort of forcing function. And what I mean by that is, right, is that when the SEC acts, it can move the markets and move market participants more swiftly and more effectively than the industry can frequently do on its own. So by introducing qualitative standards, and again, this can be principle-based at a very high level. This can then cascade down into guidance, supervisory guidance, right, and standards, and you can have real qualitative things that you're looking at and you're assessing service providers for. And I think what that permits you to do, right, is that permits you to get to a world where you have self-custody, you have bank custody, both are viable options, and we have the trust and, again, the comfort that both are operating in a way that's going to guarantee the integrity of the assets.
Got it. So, as was mentioned a few times, the SEC has this special purpose broker-dealer framework. It's not very much used at the moment. And it essentially says a broker-dealer, if it doesn't hold traditional securities, doesn't hold digital assets that aren't securities, it can, and a number of other conditions, it can comply with, or at least not be subject to risk of being out of compliance with the customer protection rule, if it has reasonable policies and procedures to do X, Y, and Z, to maintain evidence that it is safekeeping the customer's assets. I've heard a few people talk about principles approach. Does anybody disagree and think that there should be a way that there are specific standards, or is a principles-based approach the right way to go so that it is somewhat flexible, but it may be also harder to examine for and ensure are being met? Baylor, I see you looking this way.
Well, I'll take it in a bit of a different direction. Baylor Myers here with BitGo, one of the original crypto companies. I previously was at the Treasury Department. I don't think we need more regulation. What we need is clarity. So at BitGo, we firmly believe in independent, qualified custody. And we believe through our state-chartered trust company that we meet the definition of qualified. And if the SEC were to clarify that, it would make it enormously more beneficial for us to do business rather than having to wave around a letter from a law firm saying, oh, you're qualified and this is what we think. If we have that clarity, we'll be able, I think, to operate more efficiently and meet investor protection. So that's my view. Not quite the answer to your question, but there it is.
Helpful. Tammy, did you have views on the principles approach or the specific mechanisms approach, or how, waving around the letter about your legal status is great, and I'm sure people have letters from us about those things, but the kinds of things that you need to get there and what should that status indicate, or what does the things you need to do to ever have that status?
Sure, thank you. Tammy Weinrib, Copper. So I think I'm a little bit in between Jason and probably Baylor to a degree. So I kind of compare it to the traditional financial world. And when I look at it, it's taking a bit of a narrow focus to true traditional fiat paper, coins, checks, things like that. When we look at our traditional financial institutions, I don't have to go to Citi to deposit my paper. I don't have to go to then Chase to deposit coins, and I don't have to go to another to deposit checks, right? Because there's a fundamental regulatory framework, there's requirements, there's rules, et cetera, and there's a soundness and safety to that where these institutions follow that framework, and so everyone's comfortable. So if it's principles-based, it's not product-based, it's not asset-based. So if the SEC is determined that securities are under their purview, and whatever, not getting into the conversation about what is a security on the digital asset side, but whatever is determined to be a security, no matter what that is, why is that not then also under the purview of the SEC? It's custody that way. And if the broker-dealer is determined to have soundness, safety, security, comprehensive compliance framework, cybersecurity, it's examined, it's audited, all the things that we know come under that umbrella. Why are we looking at it as a product-based assessment and not a principles and rules-based assessment?
Well, are principles-based and rules-based the same? This is a discussion I often have. People like principles until...
They're inextricably linked. They're not necessarily the same, but it's a rules and principles versus a product and asset.
Got it.
I think it would be the principal component is important because the rules will be out of date very quickly. I think that's the core of it. The one thing I want to just echo though is, so at Kraken we've been doing safe custody of client assets now for 13 plus years. We think we're pretty good at it. I think we are pretty good at it. Anchorage is also actually really good at it.
We're so good.
Us out.
But there are lots and lots of regulated entities that just don't have the experience yet, and this is a very complicated thing to get right. It is not like anything that you've custodied before, and so it is important that we don't accidentally reduce choice of provider and choice of and the ability for companies that know how to do this well to do it by artificially putting specific regulatory groups that can provide that at the moment. And so maybe we'll get there and this will get easier over time, and there are lots of great technical providers around this table and others who will help us get there, but it's not true in the next 6, 12, 18 months that this will be a really easy thing for someone who is a regulated bank or otherwise to do, unless they've spent a long time at it.
Brandon, You're also representing a regulated entity that provides custody. What is your view on how these rules should work and what should be required or what principles should be imposed?
Yeah, thanks. Brandon Russell, Etana Custody. We are a state charter trust. I think under the custody rule, right now you can kind of see that there is a framework for regulated monies to find a pathway into this asset class. As it relates to the question about self-custody or regulated custody, I kind of view, we've kind of viewed the fact that the providers that are providing self-custody are almost like SaaS solutions, and the regulatory framework can be provided around them. It gives your subset of clients a level of choice in that scenario, and the regulatory responsibilities that you have, or reporting responsibilities that you have, are then beholden on the regulated entity facing off to the regulators. That's what we see the world as on that side. As it relates to other custodians in the place, we've also, over the years, deployed a best-of-breed scenario where we can plug into Fireblocks or BitGo as a regulated entity. More specifically, Coinbase has also been a sub-custodial layer for us. And this provides our clients downstream to do their own due diligence and kind of figure out what is best suited for their needs. There's another aspect to this, though, as well, and that is the settlement aspect of it. Once you start moving assets across multiple systems, so we've been a long-standing friend of Kraken, but clients do want to have access to one marketplace, a digital asset platform like yourselves, and then perhaps another one like Coinbase, hypothetically speaking. The ability to move those assets across different wallets do pose challenges, and so having systems in place and oversight in place that make sure that you don't have the tech risk or the reg risk, and you doing the adequate reporting on it is really important to ascertain.
I'm going to ask a technical question. As I mentioned, the SPBD guidance refers to brokers having to make sure they have exclusive control. And the question I've heard asked is, how do you prove a negative? How do you, with paper, stock certificate, everybody knows there's one certificate, maybe not, but let's say there's one certificate that's in a vault, you know that nobody else has it. A private key for digital assets, in some ways, at least theoretically, it's impossible to prove that nobody else has a copy of it. What technical ability is there, if there is one, so that regulators could get comfortable that there is exclusive control, that nobody else has a copy of the private key? I don't know if I could start with Terrence on this one. I think we probably have a few people that have views.
Sure. Terrence Dempsey, Fidelity Digital Assets. I agree with you that trying to prove exclusive control is challenging of the private key on the wallet. That said, I do think custodians have the ability to demonstrate control through their custody practices. So as you think about key generation ceremonies, having those audited, having reports you can provide to your clients or your regulator to show the standards, the policies and procedures that you have set up around those key generation ceremonies, how you store your keys, how you control your keys, how you utilize your keys. That you therefore may not have, cannot prove that you have exclusive control, but you have the safeguards that sit around that to help provide, transparency around what you've done for providing control of those assets.
Rachel?
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked about this before, right? And, Baylor, you and I were talking about this in the green room before this. Exclusive control over the assets is part and parcel to the custodial solution that is being provided, right? So regardless of how you do that and how those key generation ceremonies occur and how those keys are stored, most custodial solutions should be able to be built in such a way that they are showing through facts and circumstances, through a combination of your operational processes and your technology solution, how exclusive control is exercised. So for us, that's extremely important. It is like the core of the solution that our founders built. And so I echo that. I don't think that I think that that's a red herring as a problem.
I agree. audits and the blockchain solve it. So we don't need more regulation, just clarity.
Well, far be it from me to suggest more regulation. But if the regulation is you've got to prove exclusive control, it sounds like you're saying, everyone is saying that there are ways to do that. How you prove it can be done. When you say audits, can you elaborate more? Is that calling up, one of the big four auditors, or is there something else like a code audit? Just to elaborate on that.
Again, we, one of the original custodians, we have always been audited. That's just our standard business practice. I think it's good business. If you're going to do business with us, you want audits. Our clients always ask, is this audited? And I think it's just that simple.
Yeah, I think it's both, right? So there are existing standards like SOC audits that look at operational controls or your technology controls, depending on the type, and could actually look at the policies, procedures, and the ongoing business practices that you have. And then if depending on the implementation, you also have very crypto-specific firms that come in and look at your environment and what you've set up technically, and can provide you a report on their findings, any deficiencies, and how you look to resolve them. And so I think there's both an opportunity for traditional consulting firms or audit firms that provide this, or very crypto-specific firms to go in and provide feedback on both of those cases.
Mark, it seemed like you were going to chime in.
There's no such thing as black and white. Maybe that's the one thing to say is you just want to have the right operational and technical controls in place. Are controls circumventable? Maybe at some point, if you go far enough down the path of things that are extremely improbable and you put enough of them together. But at its core, the right key ceremonies, the right technical solutions, you actually never have access to keys, solve most of this problem. And actually, I think the focus on keys in the regulatory regime is totally the wrong one, and takes us out of an effective control principles-based standard and into a specific technical component of that is just the best way to hold keys 10 years ago and the best way to hold keys today is not the same. And so if you I hope it will not be the same another 5-10 years from now. And so we can't write rules about how exactly to hold your keys, or we'll end up in a spot in 3 years where actually we are causing harm to end clients, not actually making it better.
So the audit point is interesting because SEC rules for broker-dealers require that they be audited, require that their custody functions be audited. So it seems like it may be a slightly different kind of audit, but not inconsistent with kind of the way things work right now traditionally. Another topic that came up, some of the commissioners' discussions were multi-signature wallets, MPC. Are there things like that should be required, or just an option, ratios between hot and cold wallets, limits of how many assets are held in particular wallets? Jason, if I start with you on that, I'm sure your firm offers a lot of those solutions. Should those be mandated? Should the SEC mandate everyone use Fireblocks, or should or should those be incorporated into their rules in some way, or allowed to everyone to sort of figure out what the best approach is?
Yeah, I mean, to also pick up on the last question a little bit too, like we shouldn't mandate the use of MPC technology. We should have an innovative and thriving and evolving and iterating, technology solution landscape. Now, Fireblocks does have a deployment of MPC technology. On the key front, right? That analysis, it can be complex, and I think it does help to have multiple data points, right? Just to take it to a very simple example, right? In the retail context, I generate a wallet. I might get a QR code. I might get a password. I write it down on a piece of paper, right? I have now the ability to read and write to the relevant blockchain, putting instructions about the disposition of the asset onto the blockchain. There is no question, I think, that this person has control over the digital asset, right? What happened in the enterprise context, right, is we got creative and we got innovative, and we said that password written on that one piece of paper is a single point of failure. And so what we're going to do to eliminate the single point of failure is we're going to tear that piece of paper up into 4 pieces, and we're going to distribute them to different places, right? Now, if a malicious actor gets one of those pieces of paper, they don't have control over the asset, right? And so that's where this conversation around how do we identify the controlling party in this multi-key scenario, I think, comes into play. In Fireblox's deployment of this technology, there is only one controlling entity. That entity is the customer, and it's very clear. And the reason that's the case is because they have key materials sufficient to read and write to the blockchain, and Fireblox does not, right? One point I would add to what other folks were saying about audits and controls, et cetera, I like to let the parties speak for themselves. I think it's really helpful. And what I mean by that is, why don't we have a look at the contract, right? So if you look at a BitGo or you look at an Anchorage, I'm guessing that there is a safekeeping promise in there, potentially, right? But it's basically a standard of care that a custodian adopts and says, you know, you give me your assets and I'm going to return them in a certain way. That's very clear in my mind, evidence of a custodial relationship and that the parties intended to enter into a custodial relationship. Our contract looks very different and has all of the markers of a SaaS contract, right? Including the allocation of responsibility and liability, et cetera, right? So I like to let the parties speak for themselves. I think it's another data point that can help broker-dealers establish who is in possession or control.
I totally agree with that. Like our contracts would, I mean, they do look different, right? Like it's, you know, it's a completely different, you know, client provider relationship in a self-custody situation than it is for a custodian, right? And I want to pick up on Mark's point, which I think is, you know, a good one. And we talked about audits, and we were talking about like service providers, but like, you know, our clients can just go onto the blockchain and see their assets, right? And so that's fully auditable. That's like full existence of the asset where they said it was going to be, right? So this is transparent. We provide an ability to move that asset. We don't move the asset for them. We verify institutional intent to move that asset, to control that asset, right? That is the clients. And so that is the custodial relationship that is provided in crypto custody, right? And so I think that that's like an important, I think that's an important distinction here because the way in which that asset is moved is pretty important, right? And there are facts and circumstances behind it, and there's multiple ways to go about that. But I think that that's an important thing, that like it's not about like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go and get, you know, some service provider to audit my processes. It's like, can my client go out and see where their assets are, and do they have and are they able to use our platform to execute their institutional intent to move that asset, to control that asset?
And clients can do that too with even in omnibus wallets through Merkle trees and other mechanisms. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. All that other stuff.
And that's
Well, that raises a good point, because your point, Rachel, about somebody being able to look at the chain and see how many assets are in the particular wallet, that works for segregated wallets. It doesn't really work, as you were saying, I think, or maybe it does, and I'd love to hear how, for omnibus wallets, where you might see there's X number of assets in there, but you don't know who they belong to beneath the custodian.
There's good technology at this point in proof of reserve studies that you can build with Merkle trees that allow you to cryptographically understand that you have a share in an omnibus wallet as well. So I don't think it's the only mechanism. Is it a little bit harder? Is it a little bit more work to do? Yes, but I think under a principles-based regime, you could absolutely still make that proof. The Canadian Securities Administrators tried the 80-20 hot and cold piece, and Rachel and I ran into this problem because on that definition, Anchorage was not a cold storage provider in the way they wrote it. And it was basically out of date the minute they wrote those rules. And so back to the principles, rules-based version, the best technology is going to move faster than the rules can be written and can be discussed in forums like this. And so we absolutely have to make sure that we're allowing broker-dealers and everyone to use the best technical solutions out there. So back to your original question, Zach, the like specific hot and cold ratios, I would strongly encourage us to try and avoid things like that.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that. So in that regime, right, it was the way that it was written, it was like, oh, you know, Anchorage, nothing's in cold storage according to that. And then in some jurisdictions, it's like everything's in cold storage, right? And so it's like, all right, you know, we're getting a little bit too in the weeds on how we're thinking about the technology, and kind of hamstringing and creating weird operational processes to meet some kind of a definition of safety that's may not be helpful.
Can I just say
Please.
that listening to this, so I'm plus oneing on the on the principles-based. And, you know, the most effective laws that I have seen and regulations have been technology neutral. And but, you know, some are risk-based with a very heavy hammer, like if, you know, look, you have to do this thing, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but if you don't do it, we will come after you with a very heavy hammer. And they're like risk-based approaches with very heavy liability at the end of it, and let you sort out how to accomplish that. So I think something like that, you know, principles, risk-based is the only thing that makes sense in, you know, we're in a world where technology moves. I mean, we all know law and regulation move really slowly, so it's not even like a question about how fast tech moves. So I'm plus oneing on that. That's my very comment.
Rachel, coming back to you for a separate question. As we discussed, broker-dealers can hold in a good control location. Banks are good control locations. Traditionally, that's where the SEC's analysis ended. Okay, it's at a bank, we're done. Should it be the same way here? Or should the SEC be involved in saying, as some staff members in the past might have indicated to me, that the SEC would look through and sort of think about, well, how does the bank custody, and is it doing it in a way that the SEC would be comfortable with? Do you want to be regulated by the SEC?
Me? No, I mean, good luck. Good luck piecing the visitorial veil of the OCC. But yeah, I think that creates a whole bunch of, you know, I mean, that's where our analysis kind of ended. We're like, okay, you said we wanted to be a bank, and we had that opportunity. I think that this is an interesting time where we're seeing more openness to the all prudential regulators, and even at this state licensing level, to open things up and really focus on their licensing processes. When we think about prudential regulation, and you know, I've spent my life thinking about my professional life thinking about prudential regulation. There's some things that prudential regulators do very well, right? And the things that I mentioned before, they think very deeply about the operational control environment of the financial service that is being offered, right? So that's the number one thing, and they're able to get in there, you know, really, really specifically. The second thing is that they're able to. There are already laws and rules and regulations around how those things operate, how we treat customer information, how we think about books and records, how we provide things like statements, how we report to our regulators, how we report financially. You know, all of those things are extremely important, including the ability to hold appropriate capital on a risk basis to make sure that we have the ability of the entity to you know, to live on. So I think that I mean, there's already a prudential framework in place that has a lot of the things that you know, that you would want from a consumer protection and a safeguarding perspective. I mean, the other thing that is, I think, extremely important is, you know, any level of bankruptcy remoteness, right? And clear rules around bankruptcy remoteness and where the assets live in the eventual case of bankruptcy. So there are various regimes in the United States that take care of that, and I think that there's, you know, but I think that we have a set of regulators that, like, that's all they focus on.
Please.
So I sort of agree and sort of disagree, right? The whole, not the entirety, but a lot of the issues over the last several years is that everyone was having to pick and choose, mostly from the TradFi regulations, in order to attempt to be in compliance with what the entirety of the space was doing. And I feel as though we'd be incredibly remiss if we the industry did not work with the administration and the regulators now in what I believe will potentially be a bit of a short window to have some version of a unifying, robust framework that works for the space. It has to be agnostic to any of our particular businesses, any of necessarily our specific products, because that becomes a very myopic view and that would be detrimental to the space. But if we can work towards a unifying basic framework, sorry, Baylor, but we do need a little bit more regulation in that regard, right? We do need something where we all can point to something and say, okay, we have some basic rules of the road, we have some basic framework to work from, because then we can take our individual products, services, things that are going to grow. It won't be out of date the second it's written, because I do agree with things that Mark and Veronica and Rachel have said. But we do have to have something unifying and robust at its core. And if we don't take the opportunity now, I'm not sure when the opportunity might come again. And I think this space is ripe for that, and we're being given that opportunity today.
Well, that's a great segue to what next question I wanted to ask about. Banks are good control locations. Federally regulated banks, certainly. Baylor, let's start with you. Should there be more clarity on what other forms of financial institutions, including state trust companies, as Commissioner Ueda alluded to, qualify as, he was referring to the Advisors Act, qualify custodian, but similarly as banks for purposes of the 34 Act?
Yeah, so I'll chime in and I'll follow up on what Tammy just said. I think when I say clarity, it's essentially just that, which is there is a framework that's been in place. It's worked remarkably well for the last 100 years. We have incredibly resilient capital markets in the United States. Now we have a new technology that needs some clarification. When my co-panelists talk about a regulatory framework, I don't know what that means. It's very vague, it's very ambiguous, and what we need is clarity, not more ambiguity. So to answer your question, we think that state chartered trust companies meet the definition of qualified, and if the SEC gives us clarity, that would be wonderful.
Brandon?
Yeah, I concur with that. I mean, the custody rule identifies state chartered trusts as being qualified custodians. We need to obviously get the clarity to make sure we can hold ourselves out that way. So I'd concur with what Baylor had to say.
Got it. +1 here too.
So, putting aside banks, everybody knows what qualifies as a bank is one question, but banks are certainly under the current rules within the definition of entities that can be good control locations. Are there other kinds of entities? Tammy, you were talking about setting some standards. Should those standards be you are licensed as XYZ, or should there be something more general where entities that do these things? Terrence, can start with you. Are there other kinds of custodians that should be able to hold custody as for broker-dealers in addition to banks and other broker-dealers?
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back to the point, Zach, you're making and some of the other panelists. Like, what are the principles or the standards that we are actually looking for out of an entity type before just going and picking types of entities? You know, a bank was selected because it meets certain criteria, right? It is regulated by it goes through supervisory exams. It has audits. It has capital requirements. The state charter regimes in various states have a lot of those characteristics as well, and therefore they could be considered a bank as part of the act. And so what I think actually, instead of thinking about it in terms of entity types, what are the things that need to be looked at? And then what entities kind of fit into that? So potentially, I guess, right? Like, I think, I do see banks being right. I do think if a broker-dealer wants to build the capability themselves and provide that capability, then they should be able to do that as long as they're meeting the principles-based standard that is out there.
Just reiterate, there aren't many organizations today that are really good at this, and so artificially limiting that, I think, will have negative consequences for crypto asset safety and custodianship.
Artificially limiting it to entities
specific types of, leaving BitGo out as an example, because we decide state level chartered banks are not permitted under these rules. We have to be careful to make sure that we support and grow the entities that are quite good at this today, including spot market brokers like crypto market brokers like Kraken as well, who are actually also quite good at this. So just trying to make sure we don't artificially leave certain organizations out by requiring specific licenses that may or may not have any impact on whether they can hold crypto assets safely.
I think what I just kind of go back to is that investors will continue to have choice. If they choose to hold an asset at a broker-dealer, they may do so, and that broker-dealer may have some limitations. If they don't want to hold it at a broker-dealer, they can continue to hold it at another entity or venue that may not have the oversight and safety and soundness that a broker-dealer may be required to have as part of that. So I'm not suggesting to artificially limit. I think if a customer decides that they want to have their assets sit in a broker-dealer, whether that's a consumer or an entity, that broker-dealer will be subject to certain oversight. Maybe there are certain benefits to that customer of holding it at a broker-dealer, but they should still certainly be able to hold that wherever they want, under their pillow, under their mattress, or at another firm.
So I had mentioned earlier that for most purposes, I would just be talking about digital assets, whether or not securities. But just come back to that, should it make a difference? If a broker is holding a digital asset, should it make a difference if it's a security or not a security? Should different standards apply? There are legal questions around the SEC's authority over non-security digital assets when they're custodied by a broker. But let's assume that authority exists. Is there any reason to distinguish for SIPA purposes or security purposes or otherwise? Terrence, if I can come back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the risk profile of the two are different. You know, a security or a digital, you know, tokenized asset that meets a definition of a security is likely either to be registered or exempt from registration and subject to certain rules and issued by a controlling entity. And there may be controls that are in place of that tokenized security that changes the risk profile of that asset versus a native digital asset. And so therefore, I would look at them very differently from an oversight perspective.
So it sounds like something Commissioner Peirce said a little earlier, where the issuer has the ability to, you know, what is the word she used, but freeze, burn, reissue, more likely the case in securities, maybe the need for the same kind of security and custody solutions are different.
Yeah, I mean, the solution may be partially the same, but perhaps some of the oversight or governance or rigor that it goes through could be different.
Does anybody think that they should be exactly the same, regardless of whether it's a security, regardless of whether it can be canceled and reissued? Tammy, I don't know if you do or not, but
No,
Okay.
I don't, and I think because at the core of the conversations we're having, I think a lot of us, and I'm not speaking about the panel, I just in general, I think a lot of people in this space, we are not looking to dismantle or fundamentally change the core parameters of the SEC or the CFTC or the FDIC, et cetera, right? We're not looking to fundamentally just break apart how these institutions have been built and what their regulatory regimes are. I don't think many of us are looking to dismantle that. So at the core, the SEC regulates securities to then all of a sudden if those of us, myself included, looking to include digital assets that are deemed securities, but then to now start breaking into that and trying to understand, well, now we're going to start to include things that are not securities, and to Terrence's very good point about, well, the risk profiles are different and how things could be custody could be different. We're now layering things that are even more complicated. So my personal opinion is no, I would not want to do that. But I would like to open up the aperture for other things that are securities.
Brandon, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can weigh in that a little bit. I think something that's been missed here is investor protections and how we really open up to broader markets. There's a whole lot of regulated money sitting on the sidelines. And for that to really engage over here, we kind of need to figure out how we shoehorn this into the framework that the crypto space has created. I do think that, as Baylor mentioned earlier, that there is a framework that's held well for the best part of 100 years and has been overseen by our federal regulators. Being able to offer these things through broker-dealers, the argument of whether it's securities or not is obviously crux to all of this. But I think there have been examples in the past where we've seen oversight on an exemption basis or an exception basis take place. And I think that's kind of probably a better framework for us to operate, where you can have a crypto asset class engaging as a new nascent and evolving asset class, engaging a regulatory environment which is kind of playing catch up. And if the regulators could give themselves an opportunity to, let's call it, give themselves some elbow room, could be under a pilot or safe harbor, then maybe there's scope for us to all kind of work more hand in hand, and instead of trying to really figure out what all the components are trying to do in a way that kind of stymies growth.
So this ties into another question that I think Commissioner Peirce asked in her list a little earlier. The special purpose broker-dealer guidance was only allowed broker-dealers, SPBDs at least, to hold digital asset securities, not non-securities. And I think underlying some of the reasoning for that was SIPC and SIPA. It's all good if this has worked very well for the last 80 years, but if we're now bringing non-securities into broker-dealers, does that need to change? How should it change? What happens if the broker's holding non-securities and those do not get the same protections that securities do from a insolvency point of view? I don't know if anybody wants to take that one. I don't know if we had somebody assigned to sort of cover that question, because it just came up in Commissioner Peirce's introduction.
I think if you want orderly markets and you want the confidence of regulated money to come into the space in a meaningful way, you need to expand SIPA's mandate on that. I know this takes an act of Congress, but I think that's probably the conversation that needs to take place. I know it's a bit of a curveball you throw in there, because it's outside it's outside the mandate of the SEC directly, right? But I do think that if you want to grow this asset class, there's got to be some kind of framework where there is exception for them to be able to add that insurance layer to it to give investor protections downstream.
You'd like to see, again, take some more work than is easy, but imagine we'd like to see mechanisms where we don't have a lot of overlapping jurisdictional oversight for the same things or for very similar things. And so if there are some assets regulated in this way and some assets regulated in that way, the more the principles can be similar, and I think they can be similar, and the more we can rely on each other's rules and passport or other mechanisms, the better, so that we don't have to create 3 sets of the same rules with 3 sets of checkers of those rules potentially. And that's something that I think is important as we think about CFTC, SEC components of this over time. And it would be a tough situation to be in spots where we just had completely unconnected paths around them for a topic like custody.
I just want to say that, I agree with that. I don't want fragmented regulation or fragmented markets or anything like that. I think that we should find a way to harmonize all that so that people aren't trying to comply with, several different regulatory regimes when they're all basically trying to get at the same thing, which is consumer protection or protection of the market or whatever it is. They're trying to get at the same thing. There should be some way to harmonize all of it.
Well, I think, Rachel, you were going to, oh, maybe not? Okay. Well, I'll just say, welcome to America, welcome to Washington, where there's 25 regulators for anything you want to do. But speaking of which, I thought, Rachel, as a representative of a bank, it probably has 25 or more regulators. That might make sense to have you follow up.
Well, so, I think what we're talking about here is, so when we're talking about resolution authority, that's like the centerpiece of a robust marketplace, right? So, that's like the thing that, to me, brings together like the markets regulators and the prudential regulators. So in the prudential space, right, like resolution authority is something that is hotly debated, and it's a reason why the prudential regulators don't really like uninsured trust banks, because they're like, oh well, we have to do this in this other way. We have a financial regulator that's not really used to doing that, who has to do that. In the FDIC insured depository institution space, you have a whole arm of the FDIC who does it. So when you think about like resolution authority in the market space and for broker dealers, I mean, you're talking about like that, the entity itself, right? Not necessarily like the activity of that entity, whether or not like the assets that they're holding or custodying is a security or not. And I think that like fundamentally, being able to give the confidence that an entity is going to be like resolved in an orderly marketplace, like really is the cornerstone of regulation, right? Like that's the thing that's the ultimate backstop.
Yeah, for broker dealers, it actually does matter because the way SIPC
Yeah.
works is that if the asset is a security, then it's covered. If it's not, it's not. And I think for banks, it's probably a lot different
Well,
because
yeah,
they don't care.
But what
the
I'm
asset
saying is like for a digital asset,
Yeah.
right? Like you should bring that into that resolution
Right.
authority
So we should
because
have-
because resolution authority essentially is like the thing that gives the consumer the confidence.
Right. Speaking of resolution and risk of insolvency and things going wrong, even the most sophisticated custodians and crypto exchanges have incidents that come up around and they get compromised. Jason, maybe I'll start with you. Recently, there was a significant exploit of Bybit, which was a non-US crypto exchange, not securities, or at least not the way the SEC thinks today, securities. What do we learn from that, in terms of how they secured customer assets, what they might have done wrong, what they should have done instead, that the SEC could think about in terms of learning lessons that would apply to US custodians?
Yeah, sure. So I have three observations about Bybit, right? And the first is obvious, but I think worth underscoring, and that is that loss events happen too frequently in this industry, and we need to do a better job of reducing those. I think all of us, right? So the second observation, right, is, and this is something I've kind of like gathered from interactions with international regulators, right? And I think really we don't have a good answer to the question of what does good look like in custody, right? So you ask regulators around the world, and they will tell institutions to use a physical hardware device. Well, Bybit used a physical hardware device, right? You ask regulators around the world, and they'll tell you to keep it in cold storage offline. Well, the assets were in cold storage offline at Bybit, right? And I don't think it's an accident in a way, right, that a physical device held in some room offline looks a lot like a gold bar in a vault, right? And I think it speaks to this kind of innate and ingrained bias we have towards the physical asset security. But if we're going to answer the question of what does good look like, we need to complete the migration to a digital native way of thinking about these things, right? And then I think that brings me to the role of the regulator. So I already said I think the SEC can serve a very important enforcing function. And by that I mean, finding the conviction to move us towards a place where we have better digital asset custody. I would analogize actually to the traditional capital markets. I think we have the greatest and most robust capital markets in the world, but they are not the greatest capital markets in the world because they're easy. They're very hard and they're very expensive to access. And that leaves us with the best and most sophisticated companies coming here. I think we need to do something similar in the digital asset context. Everyone up here will, I think, agree with me. It is not easy to do digital asset custody well. We should be pushing SEC registrants and their customers to those who do, and we should not be exposing them to those who have not demonstrated they can.
Hear, hear.
Could I jump in real quick?
Please.
With Bybit, I think it's important to note they did not have 100% cold storage, and that was one of the biggest issues. They also did not have an independent qualified custodian like BitGo. And we learned this at BitGo when FTX went down. There was a hack, and BitGo was called in the middle of the night by John Ray, who had taken over the company after it went into receivership. And we had to put together an emergency team and go in and secure the assets. Now, had Sam Bankman-Fried used BitGo, he might not be in jail. So this is important. It's very important.
Or been a fraudster.
Well,
Right.
I just say
Fraud and loss of
self-custody?
custody might be a little different, but please, Tammy.
Many people talk about the hack and like, can we please not put Bybit in the same boat as FTX, which was a complete Ponzi scheme, and he was a fraudster, and Bybit was not that.
Both are solved by independent qualified custody.
Well, I guess I don't know if you've solved fraud by using a custodian in this way. Fraudsters will be fraudsters, I suppose, and they'll figure out ways around it. Maybe not, maybe not. How do you prevent fraud? How can you prevent them from stealing assets if they are so inclined?
To be clear, I'm not saying that we could have prevented the fraud, but had there been an independent qualified custodian, there's no way the fraud could have been perpetrated because we would have known about it.
Well,
Come on, Mark. I know you've got some thoughts. Okay. Terrence, I think this was a matter you might have had some thoughts on as well.
No, already said, yep.
Okay.
I have nothing to add to what Jason added.
Got it. Mark, have you regained composure? Thoughts around lessons learned from the Bybit, and I haven't called it a hack because I think hack is overused when something's an exploit. Often hacks, in my view, are people getting into systems they shouldn't, as opposed to exploits where people figure out ways to still get into systems they shouldn't, but not like finding code errors, but more human social engineering and that sort of thing.
I'll just say, I said it a little bit earlier, but I'll say it again. The less crypto moves around, the less people have to approve things to move it around, the better. If every time a gold trade happened, someone had to put in a truck and move it somewhere, gold would get stolen more often. And that's why I believe heavily in omnibus wallets. It's actually, they're related to this topic of bankruptcy remoteness, of course. But I think we overestimate the bankruptcy remoteness risk and we underestimate the exploit risk. And too often, I think the regulatory regimes are really focused on the bankruptcy remoteness risk and miss out on that piece. And so I would just encourage us, as we think about this, less segregation means less movement, more netting and longer time periods to net means less movement. Less movement means less likelihood of issues potentially over time.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that anybody disagrees with that. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right, but I mean, that can also happen within a custodial solution as well, right? And I think that when we're thinking about a principles-based approach to regulation and kind of not making, not limiting our, not limiting how we think about market structure by the technology that exists today, but rather thinking about from a first principles basis as to what do we want our custodians or those keeping client assets safe, what do we want them to look like and what do we want them to be able to do to solve the problems that Mark is talking about operationally. That's how the regulations should be written. And I think that Veronica made a really good point about kind of like a liability regime, right, where you're we're not prescribing specific ways to do it, but holding you accountable for an outcome, right? And I think that that's extremely important, right? And Jason, you said that too, we have to do better in securing assets. We need to be held accountable to an outcome.
So, Mark, I wanted to push a little on something you said, twice that you said it, about assets at rest being safest. Because this panel is about broker-dealers, they're typically not just providing custody like banks might, but they are facilitating customers' trading activity where, by definition, the assets are moving when they're being bought and sold. Your point about omnibus custody works if everybody's a customer of the same firm. Do you think that should sort of be the standard for crypto? Should there be, or digital asset securities, should there be a clearing function where the assets can remain at rest at the clearing agency and be immobilized the way DTC works? How do we marry these two of it having a trading environment while also keeping the assets at rest?
I don't think I'm pushing for less segregation, not no movement of crypto assets. Obviously, there will always be crypto assets that are moving, but you'd like to keep the moving liquid component of it smaller. And to do that, you can group more. So if two people trade on Kraken, we don't have to actually move crypto assets in that scenario. So you can move it less often. We can also make sure that, well, I lost my train of thought, sorry. We can also make sure that we have fewer geographical constraints. That's an option as well. There's lots of different ways to potentially do that. But the less we actually use, we put big sums and we move lots around all the time and we don't net. We can do it once every a week, trade between or move money between two broker dealers instead of actually every hour. The more we do that, the less likely each of those specific events is going to lead to an exploit potentially. And there's a balance between those two components of it, but we don't necessarily, I don't think we always take that balance into account. And I'm not proposing that we move everything and never run any on-chain transactions again, but simultaneously, we don't want to make every single trade a on-chain transaction if we can avoid it, because that means you don't have to keep all of your assets in places where they can be put on chain and moved to somebody else immediately. So the less you keep in that super liquid bucket, the better.
If we went to a standard where you had end-of-day settlement, if you're not settling every day across your custodial, centralized clearing model, then you've got to deal with perfected interest. That's something we don't really address. I think accounts should be segregated to the extent they can. I know you're not saying they shouldn't be. They should. You're just trying to create some efficiencies over here as relates to how capital moves or how crypto moves specifically. We also have to address what the counterparties in this broader ecosystem are all doing. So to fetch liquidity, and I'm just assuming on your behalf here, that you're not fetching it all internally. You're going out to a marketplace to fetch that liquidity, and typically they want to settle same day. I know you have a central order book, and that's also got to be managed across the various entities based on where they're regulated. And that all ties into how we custody those assets as well, so that you can actually enact settlement within the window that's being suggested.
Don't get me wrong, there's a balance between these pieces. I just think historically we have balanced fully on the bankruptcy remote component and not so much on, whether we settle end of day. I have spoken to other regulators around the world who assume, well, it's your crypto assets, they can be instantly settled. So let's settle every transaction. We should make sure we stay away from mechanisms.
Settle every transaction on chain.
Yeah, I settle every transaction on chain in the moment.
That has its challenges too, though.
Absolutely.
Because now you're not dealing with best order execution anymore, are you?
And there's a cost to that.
Absolutely.
In terms of gas, certainly. Tim, were you going to say something? Okay. Any other views on sort of, it sounds like there's a bit of a debate between more segregation, more on-chain separate wallets versus omnibus. Anyone else have thoughts on that dichotomy?
I think how you hold those assets really comes into play. So, for purposes of trading and establishing liquidity, you probably want to have those in an account that's somewhat separate. So it's held for benefit of that trading, for the moment in trading, and then when assets are no longer required for trading, they go into a rest state, which we kind of consider to be custody, our internal nomenclature. And in that state, then it's basically in lockdown, and it's not accessible to any form of outside activity.
Yeah, I mean, we work the same way. The other thing that's important to note is requirements around so there's the segregation of wallets and what's visible on chain and what isn't, right? We obviously have clients who don't want their positions to be seen, and so they want to make sure that that can be not so transparent.
They want it to be omnibus.
Yeah. So there are elements where you want to have certain things that have elements of omnibus, right? So you're not. So every type of position isn't completely and fully transparent. But I think that that's a bit of a different issue than when we think about, an omnibus solution that's like, a mush pot of like different client assets that exists like kind of in perpetuity and not in, in kind of a holding area in satisfaction of a settlement of a trading activity, right? And so, yeah, I think those are just kind of two different concepts.
Okay. Sure, please.
I think if we come back to how we think about our principles-based standards that we've been up here talking about, I don't know that requiring omnibus versus segregated falls into that, right? So I think, there may be a standard to disclose, and you provide a disclosure of how assets are being held at certain times, and that should be upon either the BD or the custodian the BD selected on how they're going to hold assets on behalf of customers, and that there are pros and cons, and risks should be disclosed to those customers on how they're handling that.
So, a topic, please.
Let me just ask, so what you just said and what had been discussed before were like the risks to the customers and if we're, and we were talking about whether or not, different entities should be able to do different things or assets should be custodied differently and some choices that end users might have. And that sort of brings up disclosures, right? If we're so concerned about people making their own choices and taking control of their, all that end up usually resulting in disclosures. So I just want to sort of ask how people feel about.
Well, I guess are disclosures the answer?
They may not be, but that's, if someone's supposed to be making an informed choice about, do I want to put my assets here, do I want them held in this certain way or this certain way, that usually will result in a disclosure requirement.
And how far can one take disclosure as the solution? Of course, the SEC is primarily a disclosure regulator, but traditionally, if you are going to do certain things and you're regulated by the SEC, that then triggers more specific requirements that you can't really disclose away. Is this asset class different that you can disclose it away, or you should tell people, here's what we're doing, and that's what it's going to be, and you can go to a different provider if you want something else?
That's what I'm getting at, really. It's more like, if we're saying, well, people should have a choice of what type of custodian they choose or how something is held, then what I mean by disclosures is give them meaningful information so they can decide for themselves if they like this solution or that solution or the other solution, what do they want? Because at the end of the day, they're taking some risks. So I'm not suggesting disclosures are the way to go. I'm just saying that's normally how this would be addressed. And if we're expecting people to make choices for themselves, we have to give them the information with which to make those choices in some manner.
I think there can be choices that are equal but different as well, and I think this is partially maybe more in that category. If we have a principles-based regime that requires a certain bar, we should then allow all of us in the industry to pick the approaches to meet that bar, and we benefit from actually making different technological choices and making different approach choices as we learn to bring down the number of incidents over time. Just take an example when all those Windows machines went down not that long ago. It was very obvious that choosing one technology solution can bring down significant portions of pieces, and while I hope no technology solution in our space will ever have a bug in it, I'm sure they will at some point. And it would be important for us to have multiple different models and approaches and technologies and mechanisms. And a principles-based approach versus a rules-based approach supports that and allows it. Do we have to disclose the choices we've made? For sure. Do we expect the user to understand the differences in the risk between those choices? Maybe for some sophisticated investors, but probably not for most. And I think that's okay as long as we set a principles-based bar that we all aim for.
It almost sounds like you're from a distributed systems, industry where having multiple redundancies is sort of the solution.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I'm totally on board with a principles-based approach, and I think that we talk about that a lot, right? Like, what do we want what do we want a custodian to be able to do? How do we want the custodian to be able to protect the, the consumer? And so, but there are certain principles that you want to have and you want to be like a little bit more explicit about, and then certain principles that you don't, right? I've heard on the panel things like, assets are safest at rest. Well, if assets are always going to be safest at rest, then we're not going to be able to use crypto the way that we want to in the future, right? Because there's a significant payments case for crypto, right? And so you want them to be safe all the time. So we want to be careful of the principles that we're thinking about and not prescribing something based on the technology that exists today, but what it's going to take and the standards that we need to take to make sure that we have a robust and efficient marketplace.
So it's come up in various points in our discussion today, but there are various non-US jurisdictions that are further along in their crypto journey and crypto regulation. We heard some examples of things that are problematic. Are there other examples of problematic views and rules that foreign regulators have taken, or lessons about more productive viewpoints and things that the SEC should look to and potentially borrow from? Mark, I start with you on that. Sorry to bring you back in, or Tammy, because you're non-US based firm.
I think you got my answer already on that one around Canada. I think that's the most obvious example.
The 80-20
missing.
issue. Yeah.
My answer is going to be somewhat generic but intentional. I think the lesson I hope the U.S. takes is internationally they've recognized the importance of the space, and they've chosen to take an intelligent, again, I'm being generic, an intelligent, logical, proactive approach at a high level for their jurisdictions and areas. And for one of the first times from a financial perspective, the U.S. is leading from behind. And if we have not recognized that, it feels like we are recognizing that now. So I hope what we are taking away is to not do this piecemeal, to not be narrow in our views as we are looking to legislate. And one of the biggest things is a lot of the last few years, what feel slightly arbitrary rules, amendments to rules, proposed amendments to rules, they were not put there by legislation. Well, that means they can be taken away without legislation. So maybe there's an opportunity to unwind some things in a fairly quick manner and put things in place wholesale, because that's more or less, from an international perspective, they've done things on a more wholesale level than a piecemeal level.
Sure. I think our markets are very different, right? It's we find when we look at international markets that they typically have a single regulator, and so it's a lot easier for the passage of legislation to pass through that. I think the U.S. markets are robust, and for the most part, a lot of that is to do with being on the front foot of how they legislate over here, and it's all been done via a very defined way of determining what an asset is, and then for finding out what the deficiency is around that. I don't think there's a whole lot of lessons we can take from international markets or international regulators as it pertains to
not
this
even
specific
things that
market.
they do poorly.
Well, it's not in my persona to focus on people that fail, unlike my esteemed partner over here. So I think there are lessons on regulation that we can look at, but I don't think it's old enough for us to actually take a historical look at it and use it in a meaningful way.
I'll chime in. I think what was probably most shameful about the last 4 years was that BitGo received approvals in multiple foreign jurisdictions, and we were essentially hamstrung in, our hometown, the home court, right? And it was really shameful and sad, and hopefully that's about to change.
And what did those foreign regulators do well that then you could think the hometown regulators could learn from?
Granted approvals? I mean, really.
Yeah.
No, what we're looking for, right, is guidance, and I think that's really what, if you want innovation and markets to move forward in a meaningful way, you can't stymie that innovation. And when you've got personas that are regulated or regulatory adjacent, they look for that guidance from regulators. And I think if you're going to look to foreign regulation as some kind of guiding light, that's probably the biggest takeaway, is that there was clarification pretty early on that allowed those markets to evolve.
+1, exactly what I meant.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Baylor said. And it's important because I've had a lot of conversations around like, we don't have a pathway to get certain licenses, and so let's like think about some kind of lesser standard when we think about like qualified custody, right? So qualified custody is like up here. It is something that is like, black and white, and there are requirements around it. And so now what we're seeing is a more open posture, right? And a more like from both the markets regulators and the prudential regulators. And so kind of like using a straw man argument to be like, okay, well, now we don't have to do X, Y, Z because there isn't a pathway. That's not really an argument today, right? Like there's a plethora of choice that's out there. And like then if you are able to apply, these principles-based approaches about like what we want that to do and, meeting, standards of regulation, there's no reason why you can't have like a whole host of qualified custodians for the market to choose from that meet certain criteria.
So I've got another curveball question that I'm not sure who I'm going to ask, but we'll see. This gets a little bit more deeper to the technology where assets can be custodied in some way within smart contracts. So it's not a particular institution holding it, but the smart contract holds it. There have been ideas discussed around that being a way to custody assets, that it's put into a smart contract and it can only come out if X, Y, Z happens. Obviously, that's the way a lot of DeFi works, where assets go into custody, they only come out if something else happens first. Is that a solution to say, no, the brokers, the banks, they aren't holding custody, it's all arranged within a smart contract so that the banks may have the way to get in, or the brokers have the way to get in, or those smart contracts are the brokers? Are smart contracts that can do that sort of thing a solution, or do they sort of bring you back to the same place where somebody's the one controlling or potentially controlling the smart contract? Brandon, I'll start with you.
You're lucky, Mark. Yeah, we're as an organization, we're pretty we're pretty conservative in terms of how we see this. The idea that we play off the front foot from an innovation point of view is not really where we're at. We face off to the market in a very jaded type way. We like, who can we trust, who can we not trust? Smart contracts kind of fall into that same thought process. So consequently, I think if you look at the Bybit, there was a smart contract involved in that hack as well. It wasn't the smart contract where the failure was. I didn't comment on this earlier, but we believe the failure in that was actually a governance issue. And so when you don't have proper policies, procedures, and you fail to follow them, and there's no one to actually enforce them, that's when these things fail. So should this evolve into smart contracts? I think, yeah, ultimately, if there's a case for us to happen where the markets or custody is more efficient as a construct of that, then I'm all for it. But it's got to be done within a framework where there is oversight and somebody can actually point to it and say, there's something wrong over here when it fails.
Can't socially engineer a smart contract, right? So doesn't that help with that Bybit situation, for example?
Yeah, I find that my life experience is that when things go wrong, people like to point at an actual person not at some kind of piece of technology.
Please.
So when I think of smart contract custody, in my head, liken it very much to normal centralized custody, right? These smart contracts that are out there are developed by someone. There are roles associated with the smart contract that are managed by addresses, which are then managed by private keys. And so if you deploy a smart contract to act as custody, there may be functions that are part of that you can call, who can upgrade, who can change the contract to make it do something different. That is controlled by a role, an address, that is controlled by a key, ultimately at the end of the day. So who's in custody of that key that can actually make changes to the smart contract or edit the smart contract? That to me is custody. Then there are other keys, right? And I think there was a conversation earlier, let's not worry about keys, and I agree with that, right? But it starts to get very technical very quick, which then there are these functional roles that may call that smart contract, that may say to move the asset out of that smart contract, that is also controlled by a role, which is controlled by a key at the end of the day, and you need to sign that transaction with that key in order to call that function. Then therefore, that is not something that I would consider custody. And so if that's the broker-dealer facilitating that, I wouldn't consider that custody, but whoever's controlling the smart contract at the end of the day, down to Brendan's point, is the custodian of that asset, in my head.
I mean, yes, that's exactly it. There's a key somewhere at the end of the day controlling that, and whoever has that is the custodian, or is custodying.
So there can't be something that is relatively autonomous, that is programmed, the key, if there was one, is thrown away and it just works in a particular way. There's got to be somebody, you're saying, that is controlling that, and they would be effectively the custodian.
Yeah, well, if it's and if it's, if you're doing that, if that's happening on behalf of a customer, then there needs to be a qualified custodian.
Yeah, I guess in theory it could work that way, right? You throw away the key. I would argue that is a bad business practice, because maybe there is an exploit or some malware and someone needs to go and update that contract, because there was a vulnerability in it, and they should, have the ability to go and do that, right? And so to me, it is smart contract custody, while very interesting, and I certainly think part of the future as you start thinking about, what does it mean for a user to hold some of these assets themselves, participate in these networks on their own, but also have that oversight from a broker-dealer, maybe where they want to see all of their assets sit or have all of their assets sit. It becomes a very interesting way to be able to use the technology that is there with us, and also, working through a broker-dealer to do that.
Would you say the same thing if a contract was not editable? Once it's been deployed, it's not editable, it could be canceled, but not edited? Would you say, I'd like to know who you think would be the appropriate person in control or custody of that. Whoever deployed it, but they can't edit it?
It just goes back to my point of, if it's non-editable, then no one is controlling it. I just don't know. It's a good business practice to have non-editable capabilities out there.
At the end of the day, there are technology controls, which may or may not include smart contracts or HSMs or key management in other ways, multi-sig. And then there are operational controls. I think a common theme on this panel is we should not mandate which specific technology or operational controls explicitly are put in place, and that the industry will continue to change over time. And the best practice on those things that applies today will be different in 6 months or a year or 5 years. So I think, can smart contracts be part of the answer? Probably. For some, in some ways. Will they be the answer for everybody right now? Are they the only answer? I would argue for sure not.
So we won't have the SEC mandating smart contracts then. So I think we're at 3 o'clock, which means this first panel needs to wrap up now. Thank you all so much for your really, really valuable insights. And I think we are going to take 30 minutes and come back for the second panel at 3:30.
All right, thank you, Zach, and just a big hand for our panelists who all did a great job. So at the beginning of our discussion, one of our panelists said that assets are at rest are most safe. And I don't have much experience personally custodying crypto, so I won't opine on that here. But one thing I do have experience custodying is ice cream. And in the case of ice cream, the idea that assets at rest are most safe is very true. First, I have to take possession of the ice cream from a giant warehouse and bring it here. Then I've had to put it in cold storage, specifically a freezer. And finally, it had to be moved to the lobby out here for you to enjoy. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll reconvene at 3:30. And just before you go, please take a look around you and introduce yourself to someone you haven't met yet. One of the purposes of these roundtables is to help you connect with other folks that are thinking about these ideas. So please do that now and then go enjoy an ice cream with your new friend. Thank you.